This video is the third part of the entire Totally Tubular Scarf and Scoody series and part 2 of the scarf. Today we will get to the point of finishing this. In the following video, we will build on the scarf and end up with this scoody. In the previous video, we got as far as knitting all of the scarf rows, all of them being tubular. To make a scarf the length shown in the picture, that should have been 244 rows, roughly an entire skein of yarn, leaving a little bit of the yarn unknitted so that we can proceed. Now it's time to transfer back to every other needle and do that on both beds. Do it in such a way that the needles alternate as for 1x1 ribbing, so that when all come out, they would not hit. In this case, they wouldn't anyway. They're not all going to come out at one time, but that's what we started with, and it's going to work well for knitting the second pom-pom too. Work all the way across doing this. We started out with 20 stitches in work on each bed, and we should end up with 10 in work on each bed. It's best to transfer all the stitches in one direction, either moving them left or moving them right. And at one end of the bed, that's going to end up with 3 stitches on one needle, which in this yarn is too many to knit off neatly. So before going any farther, manually knit off that stitch. Yes, it is an extra, but it will hide. Tie the fun fur yarn to the tail that we left of the main yarn, just as we did when creating the first pom-pom. Now we'll knit the second pom-pom in fun fur on every other needle. Expect the first round to be quite stiff because we do have 2 stitches of thick yarn on each needle, but it should knit off okay, and once we're feeding only fun fur, it will get very much easier. Knit 16 rows on the counter, which is 8 complete rounds, and remember from time to time to pull down the knitting so as to prevent those hairs from grabbing the gate pegs and hanging up the knitting. Pull out about 24 inches, a good long tail, of the fun fur yarn and snip it. And now we're going to use that yarn tail to gather off the remainder of the stitches. Put the yarn tail into a yarn needle and carefully make sure you go through each stitch in order. I went through main bed stitches first, then river stitches, released them 1 or 2 at a time, picked up the next one, and then gradually pulled the yarn through. I'm showing you several different methods that I tried. They're all equally okay. Your hazard is catching your yarn tail on the gate pegs, of course. I did try it in a minute with the beds open, and I do believe that helped a little bit. The challenge here is that with all those hairs to look at, you must make certain you actually go into the stitch. It's not difficult to do, but it is easy to get fooled about where it is. So be patient. An alternative, if you don't like doing this on the machine, is to remove the work on waste yarn. Then perform this same function of sliding the yarn tail through each stitch in order with the work off of the machine, and then remove the waste yarn. It's worth being pretty attentive here, because if you drop a stitch, finding it with all those hairy hairs sticking out is a pain in the neck. It's not that the yarn is terribly prone to dropping stitches, but you can't see it very well if you do, and it always shows up later when you're wearing the garment someplace you want to look nice. I found it useful to leave a little bit of weight on the machine while doing the back bed, the main bed, and then remove it for doing the river bed. Working across the river, I found that a different technique worked best for getting each stitch off. I'm pulling the needles up, putting the eye of my double eye needle in the hooks, and lifting the stitches off one at a time that way, and then pulling the needle backwards into its resting position, and that works quite well. When each stitch is threaded onto the yarn tail, you can then just lift the whole piece of work off of the machine. Now we proceed to the finishing. The first thing is to use the yarn tail, onto which we threaded all of the last stitches, as a drawstring, and close the bottom of the pom-pom and knot it securely. The knots will hide, so there's no need to be worried about that. because when we fluff it up, the fuzzy yarn hides just pretty much everything. Now insert the needle, still holding the yarn tail, into the inside of the pom-pom and bring it up without pulling it short, right where the main knitting and the pom-pom join. This won't look very attractive to you yet. The places where the stitches were decreased are very obvious, but run the yarn needle in and out of those stitches, and we'll make another drawstring in this area. Pull it in tightly, and when we fluff up the pom-pom, it will be completely hidden. So don't worry about the fact that it's not beautiful yet. Besides threading it through all the stitches, I wrapped the yarn tail around the pom-pom at the neck of it where the two yarns join and knotted it securely. Now we can insert the yarn tail once more into the pom-pom after I sort my knot out. They do like to hang up on each other. Those hairs do. Pull through and then snip it off and it won't show. Your fur may or may not look good yet, but it will definitely look better if you comb it or pluck it. I don't have a comb handy, so I'm using my fingers. A wig brush works well. A comb that you would use on a pet works well. Why this is needed is because when machine knitting, the little hairs tend to stay caught in the knitting, in the stitches. When you're knitting by hand, that doesn't happen so much just because you manually twist and turn the fabric as you continue to knit. So the second pom-pom that we actually knitted is the first one that we finish. Now we'll go ahead and finish the first one that we knitted in pretty much the same manner. I freed the yarn tail, the initial yarn tail, and if I thought ahead a little bit better, I would have left it longer, but I do have enough to work with. And it now needs to be worked in and out of the first row of true stitches for the furry yarn, not the last row of the waist yarn. And just as when binding off, there is no real mystery to this, but it's easy to let your eye get confused, so be careful. Work all the way around, making sure that every stitch is caught, pulling it to and fro to examine them if need be, as I am here. And then it'll be time to remove the waist yarn. It's best to remove the waist yarn before we pull the drawstring tight, otherwise it's very difficult. You may wonder why I did not suggest a ravel cord between the two yarns, and it's a judgment call. I decided not to because ravel cord is slippery and the fun fur yarn is slippery, and I thought that might be overly problematic. Doing it this way, though, I will have to snip the waist yarn, not main yarn. I will have to snip the waist yarn to remove it. Be very, very careful to only snip main yarn and to snip it in the row closest to the fur yarn. And a sensible knitter would have put her ribber cover on for this process, or worked over a table. You may have to snip more than once to easily get all the yarn out, the waist yarn that is, because it will tend to tangle into those hairs for the fun fur, but it'll all come out, no problem. When the last of the waist yarn is gone, go ahead and use the yarn tail that we already threaded through those stitches to draw them in. So we've got a tight end on this tassel, and then poke it through so as to weave in and out of the area where there was every other stitch on the last row of main yarn, or first row of main yarn in this case, and gather it in and tie around it just as we did on the other end. If you failed to leave yourself a long enough initial yarn tail to do this second part, it can be a second piece of yarn. I did fail, and this is a second piece. It's working fine. Wrap the end of the pom-pom where it joins the main yarn and knot it securely just as we did before. Push the yarn needle into the pom-pom and snip off the tail. And of course, comb or pluck or otherwise fluff up pom-pom number 2 so that it looks just as nice as pom-pom number 1. Sometimes you may think you've done all you can, But if you look closely, you will find more hairs still caught. So the more attention you give to this combing out process, the prettier the pom-poms will be. Now they're both beautiful. You have finished your totally tubular scarf. If you would like to turn it into a scoody, move on to the next video. The hood we'll add does not require tubular knitting and is the absolutely simplest kind of hood that you can knit, but it works great for this project. See you there.